All right, we are going to be talking about Chapter 1 from The Challenge of Democracy, which is our textbook. You'll notice this PowerPoint I have goes with the 13th edition, and our current edition is the 14th edition, but there's not really any difference, and my notes will be coming from the 14th edition. I expect you, as we go through this, to take notes and keep up with this information. You are expected to know this, and you will be tested over this. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter to you or give you detailed notes over the whole chapter because I expect you to read chapters 1 and chapter 2, which are this week, and we'll look at chapter 2 later. But I expect you to read these on your own and to gather the information. I want to give you an overview and point out the high points that I think you need to make sure that you know as we go into this particular week's worth of lessons. Chapter 1 deals with freedom, order, or equality. Now, as we get to the end of chapter 1, you should be able to do these things. These are the objectives we have for chapter 1, or the learning outcomes. Number 1, define globalization and explain how it affects American politics and government. Number 2, identify the purposes that government serves and trace their historical roots. 3, describe how political scientists use concepts to structure events and promote understanding. 4, define freedom, order, and equality and discuss the various interpretations of each value. 5, analyze the inherent conflicts between freedom versus order and freedom versus equality. 6, distinguish among these terms: totalitarianism, socialism, capitalism, libertarianism, and anarchism. And 7, explain how liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and communitarians view the role of government. All right. Now, you had been asked before we began this lecture to come up with your own definition of government. Now, I want to share with you the book's definition of government, and out of all the definitions of government that I have ever seen in all my studies and research, this is my favorite. Government is a legitimate use of force within specified geographical boundaries to control human behavior. So I always shorten it down to the legitimate use of force to control human behavior. That is what government is. And if you think about it, that makes absolutely perfect sense. Our government institutes speed limits. Why do they do that? To control your behavior, so that you don't go too fast and possibly put yourself or someone else at risk. They're trying to control your behavior. Okay, if you break that speed limit and you're going too fast, what do? They pull you over and they give you a ticket. If you're going too fast, way too fast, or you refuse to pull over or something along those lines, what will they do? They will eventually stop you and they'll take you to jail. They are using force to control your human behavior, and they'll do that in whatever ways they can. Now, in order for a government to exist and to function, it has to have national sovereignty. National sovereignty, it means that it is a government's externally recognized right to exercise final authority over its own affairs. In other words, the United States government has the authority and the right to rule within the United States. We can pass laws within the United States that apply to United States citizens within the United States. The country of Russia can pass laws that apply to its people within its country. However, the Russian government cannot pass a law that applies to American citizens in the United States. They can pass laws that apply to American citizens that happen to be in Russia, but not in the United States. Their rule, their authority does not come into our country, and ours does not go into their country. Now, in our current days, in the last couple hundred years, the world has become a much smaller place. Communications technology has increased tremendously, so that I can literally get on my computer or on my phone and talk to someone on the other side of the world in real time, face to face, with us seeing one another. We also know that we can hop on a plane and be in another country in a matter of hours. And be able to trade with other countries, and there's constantly trade and things going on. So as the technology increases and the ability to communicate and to be in other parts of the world increases, the world figuratively becomes a smaller place, and it becomes more interdependent on other countries. That's what globalization is, the increasing interdependence of citizens and nations across the world. There are countries in the world that need what the United States and other countries have, or it could not survive. Those countries could not survive. There are some things that maybe we don't have that we need from other countries that we need to help us survive. As the world becomes more globalized and people become more and more dependent on other countries, national sovereignty becomes more and more threatened. So a stronger country can threaten a weaker country by cutting off its supplies or its flow of money or something like that, and force that smaller, weaker country to bow to the stronger country's wishes and desires. So national sovereignty is sometimes threatened by globalization. It's always been an issue, but now it's a bigger issue because the world is a much smaller place. The United States at some point created an international criminal court to help deal with the problem of international criminals that would go from one country to another committing crimes. Now, you had been, and we'll just go on from that. What I want to talk about next is the three purposes of government. Now, the first and the oldest purpose of government is to maintain order, okay? Order refers to the established ways of social behavior. Now, up until the time of the Enlightenment, and even in some parts of the world to this day, most people believed that government existed because God willed it to be so, okay? That a person was in charge, a king and sometimes a queen would be in power because God had placed them in that position of power, usually by the right of their birth, sometimes by other ways, but usually they were born into the position, and because of that, they had the right from God to rule. It's called the divine right of kings in the West. Now in China, they called it the mandate of heaven, that God had, that the gods, they believed in multiple gods, had ordained that this emperor was going to rise and rule at this particular time, and should that emperor lose its right, its mandate from heaven, then someone else would take over and would reign. But this idea of the divine right of kings or the mandate of heaven meant that the sovereign, the ruler, the king, the emperor, had all authority and all power. If you had any rights, it was because that king or that emperor gave you those rights, and that's the way God wanted it to be. So most people in most countries would never question their king or their sovereign, because to do so would be literally to question or to balk against the authority of God. But in the Enlightenment, particularly in England, you had philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke that were coming up with different ideas about where government originated. They did not believe that government came about because God designed it and deigned it to be so and gave someone the divine right to rule, but they believed that government came about from something different. And this was revolutionary in its day. And in just a moment, I'm going to tell you what that is. But what I want you to understand first is Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and some of these others believed that life without government, now sometimes they defined this a little differently, but that life without government is life in a state of nature. What I mean by that is that you have absolute freedom. There's anarchy. There is no government. And think about it. If you have no government, then what do? You do whatever you want to do, right? Because there's no one there to control your behavior as far as the government goes. Now, the problem is other people can do what they want to do. If they want to come and rob you and you can't stop them, there's no government there to protect you, okay? But it's an absolute state of freedom, absolute state of nature, and there is no government. So they believed, and again, they defined terms somewhat differently, but basically the same. Had the same basic ideas, but basically they believed that at some point in history, people became tired of living in the state of nature and were tired of not having any security or safety at all. So they believed that people came together and formed a contract. The term is known as a social contract. Let me say that again because it's a term that you need to make sure you know. Social contract. What that means is that the people came together and they determined they did not want to live in a state of nature or absolute anarchy anymore. They wanted a certain measure of safety and security. In other words, they wanted a certain measure of order. So they came together and they formed a government, and they gave the government the consent to govern them. In other words, they were willing to give up some of their freedom in order to have a little bit of security from this government. But the government only ruled because they gave them the consent to do so, the right to do so. Thomas Hobbes believed that the government should be headed up by what he called a Leviathan. Now, Leviathan basically was a sea monster in ancient times in their thoughts. But if you look in your book, there is a picture of this Leviathan that Hobbes believed in. He believed that the government was run by an all-powerful sovereign or monarch or king. Okay, but if you look in the picture, in this king, this sovereign, this Leviathan has a sword in one hand and a scepter of justice in the other. In other words, he was there to enforce the rules and also to bring about justice in his other hand. But if you will look closely at before I get to that, he's presiding over a town that is has order and is in peace. But if you will look closely at the drawing, the body of the king is made up of the individual people. In other words, the people came together to give that king his authority. He only had authority because of the consent of the people, the consent of the governed. Now, in our times, that's normal thinking. How does a preamble of our Constitution begin? We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. So we've been inbred and indoctrinated with this idea that government receives its power to govern us because we, the people, give it the power to do that. But when Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and the others were writing these things and coming up with these ideas, that was revolutionary. People didn't believe that. This was something the kings didn't like, because now suddenly the kings don't have the right to rule because God told them that anymore, but because of the consent of the governed. If the consent of the governed is taken away, then they're no longer in power. So this was a totally different way of looking at things, and it was revolutionary. And I want you to just think about how big of a change in thought that was, to go from thinking that the king is all powerful because God made it so, to now the king has power only because we, the people, have given the king power. John Locke also spoke in his writing of what is termed as liberalism. Now, please do not confuse the term that he used with liberalism in today's modern American politics. They do not mean the same. Liberalism, as defined by John Locke, is this idea that governments should leave individuals free to follow their individual pursuits. In other words, that people have certain rights and freedoms, and the government has to step out of the way to allow those people to pursue those things. Okay? That idea was later developed by Thomas Jefferson in our Declaration of Independence to say that all men are created equal and endowed with their Creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, we have these certain rights and liberties that have been given to us by God. We formed a government to protect those rights, not to take away those rights, not to give those rights, but to protect those rights. That's why we have a Bill of Rights in our Constitution. We wanted to define what rights we believe that God has given to every individual, that the government is there to protect and defend, but the government does not give those rights to us. They don't have the authority to do that. Only God does that. Okay? So these were the ideas that they had. And so as they believed this, they believed that government's only purpose at the time was to protect these liberties and these rights, to keep you safe so that you can pursue freedom of worship as you desire, to keep you safe so that you can speak as your heart desires, so that you can assemble or gather with whoever you want, or whatever the purpose may be. Your government was given the authority to rule by you so that it could protect and defend your God-given rights. It was a revolutionary way of thinking. Completely changed the way things were thought of in the way of government. And our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, George Washington, all of these people based their ideas on the writings of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others that had the same basic ideas about how government would go. Now, we decided not to go with a monarchy, but we basically took the same rights and the same ideas that they had to form our government. Now, later on in the 1800s, Karl Marx came along, and he had a different philosophy on government. He came up with the idea of communism, and I don't really want to get into that too much today. Basically, in true communism as defined by Marx, there would be no government because people would just do what was right. They would just do what they were supposed to, so you wouldn't really need a government. But the way it has worked out, government owns the land and all productive facilities, and everything is supposed to be shared equally. But we'll talk about that at another time. Okay, so the oldest purpose of government is maintaining order. Only in the last 100 to 150 years, maybe 200 years at the max, has it begun to be different. There begun to be different ideas about what else government should do for us besides maintain order and keep us safe to pursue our liberties. Oh, here's the picture of Hobbes. I forgot it was in my thing, in my PowerPoint. But if you'll notice, his body is made up of the people. Here's his sword of justice. That's his sword. This is a scepter of justice. Here's the city that he's presiding over. Now, the second purpose that came along next was this idea of providing public goods. These are benefits and services that benefit all citizens, but are not likely to be produced voluntarily by individuals. In other words, things like parks and sanitation. We have a sewer system in the cities today, not because it's profitable to have one, but because the government decided we needed one and no one else was going to provide that, so the government provides that public good. We have parks, not because they're profitable, but because the government decided it was something that would be good for people, and we have those. They have roads, they provide schools, all kinds of things are provided to the people as a whole by the government, because private individuals are not likely to provide those. But this is a newer purpose of government. And if you look into the early to mid 1800s, especially with the Whig Party, that was kind of their idea, that government should begin to provide some of these public goods, that railroads should be provided by the government so that we can have better transportation, and roads and canals and things like that. But that was a relatively new idea in the 1800s when they came up with it. Now, the third purpose of government is one that really has only gained prominence in the 20th century. It kind of began to be spoken of in the 19th century, but really has only begun to be prominent in the last 100 to 120 years, and that's this idea of government promoting equality. In the European countries, most of those countries, even though they are a form of democracy, they are somewhat of a welfare state. What that means is that they provide a lot of services that are meant to take care of their people, like they have in many of those countries universal health care. And we'll talk about that at another time, so I don't want to get into that debate right now. But they also have, in some of those countries, universal child care. They make sure that everyone has a certain measure of housing and things like that. This is the most controversial purpose of government, because in order to promote equality, what has to happen? Someone else's freedom has to be infringed upon. So, for instance, in promoting equality, there has to be a certain measure of redistribution of income. In other words, we have to take money from somebody to give it to somebody else. Think about Medicaid, for instance. Medicaid is an health insurance system for people who live in poverty. But who pays for that? The citizens of the country. So when I work, or when you work and we pay taxes, part of those taxes go to provide health care for the poorest people in our country. And I'm not here to debate whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. The point I'm trying to make is this: in order to do that, somebody has to lose their freedom. My money, your money, whatever is taken away so that someone else can have something else. That's what we mean by that redistribution of income. Now, in the Great Depression, many of these ideas came about. So what kind of policies were passed during the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt? Social Security. Medicare came along in the 60s. Different ideas came about, starting with the Great Depression, that were really passed then because people were so poor and in such desperate need that the government, backed by the people for the most part, began to want to promote equality. Another one would be something like, and here we see it as civil unions. It's changed since the writing of this book, but the same-sex marriage. Okay, that's something that was not legal in every state in our country until 2015, when the Supreme Court made it so. But that is a controversial policy that probably is less controversial today in 2020 than it was in 2015, certainly than in 2010, and certainly than in 1990 or 1980 or 1900. But this idea of the government promoting equality is a relatively new one. It is very controversial. It requires limiting the freedom of some to give equality to others. We'll talk more about that later. So again, I want you to think about the three purposes of government are maintaining order, providing for the public goods, and promoting equality. Okay, now here's Rosa Parks, a picture of Rosa Parks, and she, of course, was working to what? To promote equality. She refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. She was arrested. The black community in Montgomery, Alabama, led a boycott on the bus company. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to national prominence at this time during that to promote equality. Okay. Now, we want to look at what's called a conceptual framework for analyzing government. And the objective for this is to describe how political scientists use concepts to structure events and promote understanding. I'm going to let you look at that and read about that, but basically it's talking about majoritarian democracy and pluralist democracy and all of that. But the value, what I want you to understand about this is there are certain values pursued by government. We talked about that. Freedom, which basically is one value. Order and equality. Freedom is you being able to do what you want to do. Order is the government controlling your behavior to some extent. And equality is government making everyone come out on the same playing field. Okay? Let's move on. Now, what you need to understand is that there's two different thoughts about what freedom means. You have freedom of, which is where the government is restrained. The government is not allowed to interfere in this. So, for instance, in our country, we have freedom of worship. In other words, you can go to a Catholic church if you want to. You can become a Baptist if you want to. You can become a Buddhist or a Taoist or Muslim or whatever you want to do. Or you can have no religion at all. You can be atheist. It doesn't matter. The government is restrained from constraining or restraining your behavior. You have the right to worship as you see fit. Okay, that's freedom of. Now, freedom from is a newer concept, and this was a concept that Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, really made popular. In fact, there is a set of posters that were produced by Norman Rockwell in the 1940s. And the first one is a picture of people praying, and it says, "Save freedom of worship, buy war bonds." This was to promote supporting the war effort. The second one was a picture of a man standing up to speak, and it says, "Save freedom of speech." But the other two dealt with freedom from. One of them is a family sitting around a table about to have a turkey dinner. And the bottom of the poster says, "Freedom from want." In other words, we want to make sure that we provide everyone a certain measure of food security. So what do we have today? We have food stamps for poor families. Freedom from fear is the third one, where this family is around this bed with these children and they're ill and there's a doctor there. And so we are there to fight from freedom from fear, to keep people from having to live in fear. This idea of freedom from is much, much newer and much, much more controversial. But the first one is where the government can't do something, and this is something the government has to do. If you're going to have freedom from want, then the government is going to have to create a program such as food stamps or Medicaid or something like that to provide for the people. Social Security is a good example. You know, you don't want to live in fear of your retirement, so they created Social Security to be a supplement or a help in your retirement so that you would not have to live in poverty in retirement. That is a brand new concept, okay? But those were promoted. That's something the government has to do, and that was promoted by Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt actually wanted to expand the the Bill of Rights to include those things, but it never did happen, okay? Then we have order. Order is preserving life and protecting property. In the preamble to the Constitution, it talks about to ensure domestic tranquility. In other words, to make sure that people live in peace. Now, at the time I'm recording this lecture, there are riots going on around our country in many major cities. That's not domestic tranquility. So what is the government going to do to promote that order? And we don't want to get into the political debate of that right now, but there is a big debate about that going on. Preserving social order. This is something that has become less and less popular as time has gone on. The social order is the accepted way of doing things. So like same-sex marriage, for instance, that was illegal in our country for so long because it was just not the way it was done. Some say that preserving the social order is not a legitimate force of power function of the government. In other words, how does the government have the right to tell someone, hey, you can't marry the person you want to marry? In order to preserve social order, the state sometimes has to use police power to do that. So if someone wanted to do something that was illegal, the state would use police power to stop that, even if it is a measure of social order. Equality. Now, there are different ideas about equality and what equality is. Political equality means one person, one vote. And we'll talk about that another time because there's some debate over that as well, as far as like the United States Senate goes. There's a thing called social equality where everyone has basically the same wealth, education, and status. You see that a lot in the more European countries like Denmark and Sweden and some of those countries that are much more homogenous in their population. And with their welfare programs, you see that people don't ever really become too wealthy, but they don't ever really get terribly poor. So you see a lot more social equality there. Probably the more common type of equality that most people in America believe in is equality of opportunity, that every person has the same chance to succeed. It does not mean they will all succeed, but they should have the same chance. Equality of outcome would mean that everyone has the same outcome. And so that's something that's a little more controversial as well. Now, government has two dilemmas. A dilemma refers to something that is a difficult decision to make. Dilemma literally means two horns. In other words, you have one decision or another decision, and they don't really mesh together, but you've got to decide one. If government is going to maintain order and promote equality, there's a problem. That's a dilemma. The problem is, in order to maintain order or promote equality, somebody's going to have to sacrifice freedom to attain that. So let's go back to the speed limit, for example. For the government to maintain that type of order, then your freedom to drive as fast as you want to has to be restrained. If they're going to promote equality, to make sure that, for instance, that people that are poor have food stamps to eat, to make sure they can eat, they're going to take away your money, which limits your freedom to use that money how you want to in order to do that. So people sacrifice freedom to gain order or equality. So the original dilemma, the original problem between government, remember the oldest purpose of government is to maintain order. So the original problem of government was how much freedom versus how much order do we give? The government is there to protect order, but how much order is too much? How much freedom should we give up in order to have that order? I believe it was John Adams, but I'm not 100% certain. But him or Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, said something along the lines of, if someone gives up a measure of freedom to attain a measure of security, that they will soon find that they don't have either one. And so there's been a lot of debate over that. The government should do some people believe the government should do as little as possible. Therefore, you have as much freedom as possible. They're not willing to give up very much freedom to provide a lot of order. For instance, a libertarian would say that the government should legalize all kinds of drugs, not because they're pro-drug use, but because they believe the government should not have their business in telling you what to do and what not to do. Let the consequences be yours. The thing we have to understand is that people value freedom, but they also value order. And those two values inherently conflict with one another, and that's the problem. Where do we draw that line? And that's been the debate for governments for as long as governments have existed. Okay. The modern dilemma is how much freedom versus how much equality. So when government promotes social equality, like the Equal Pay Act, or school busing to minimize segregation, or pay equity, that's where people receive the same kind of pay, discrimination issues and things like that, people lose their freedom. So for instance, in the civil rights movement, the government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against people based upon their race, religion, gender, things like that, when it comes to like serving them in a cafe. So let's say you own a cafe. the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits you from discriminating against serving against, let me start over. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not allow you to say, hey, if you're this color or this religion or this gender, you can't come in here. It does not allow that. So you as a business owner have lost your freedom, but someone else has gained equality in the process. Do you see what I'm saying? So the modern dilemma of government is how much freedom do we give versus how much equality do we grant to everyone else? And these are the debates this is what every political campaign is made up of in our day. Now, moving on very quickly, totalitarianism is this idea that government has unlimited power, and different types of countries, different types of government are totalitarian. Most communist governments are totalitarian. Many dictatorships are totalitarian. For instance, the Sultan of Brunei, he's the king of Brunei, a small country in Asia, and he has absolute 100% power. That's totalitarian. Socialism, the practice of socialism can lead to totalitarianism. The Nazi Party in Germany, for instance, was a socialist party, and it led to totalitarianism. But just because someone's socialist does not mean they are totalitarian. So you need to keep that difference in mind. In socialism, government owns the basic industries, or they may not own them outright, but they control them. They determine what they're going to produce, how much they're going to pay, that kind of stuff. Outside of the United States, socialism is not viewed as necessarily bad. Inside the United States, at least until modern times, very recent times, it was considered not very nice. Democratic socialism is this idea that we can guarantee civil liberties, free elections, and political parties and things like that, but the government still controls certain industries and things like that. Bernie Sanders is probably the most well-known democratic socialist in the United States. Here are some political theories. The least government will be anarchist. The most government will be totalitarianism. Then you have libertarianism and liberalism in there. Economic theories would be laissez-faire, where the government lets businesses do whatever they want to. Capitalism has some control of government, but not much. Socialism, the government basically runs the economy. The popular political labels in the United States are conservative and liberal. Conservative would be less government. Liberal would be more government. We'll talk more about that later. I'm going to let you read about this in your book. Let me go back just a little bit. In libertarianism, they want government action completely limited unless it's absolutely necessary to protect life and property. They do not believe government should promote order or equality, and they believe in laissez-faire economics. And that's pretty important. The Libertarian Party and the libertarian branches of the Republican and Democratic parties tend to be growing in our day. Anarchism opposes government of any form. You're seeing some of this in some of the riots in some of the cities in our country. Liberals and conservatives are basically in the middle. Liberals favor more government, like social programs like welfare and things like that. More money for education, wildlife support, public transportation. Conservatives favor less government. They don't really want the job programs. They want less taxes. They want less legislation controlling the working conditions and things like that. Today's liberals versus conservatives focus on the purpose of government. Conservatives support the original purpose of maintaining social order. Liberals support the use of government to promote equality. You also have libertarians, which value freedom more than equality or order, and you have liberals, which value freedom more than order, but not more than equality. Conservatives value freedom more than equality, but would restrict freedom to preserve social order. So conservatives, by and large, are not in favor of same-sex marriage. Communitarians value both equality and order more than freedom. They really don't care so much about the freedom. They want people to be equal and the government to control things. Here's a good example. Modern dilemma, freedom versus equality. The original dilemma, freedom versus order. Libertarians are in the freedom side. They don't want government doing anything except what's absolutely necessary. Okay. Liberals want way more equality, less freedom. Conservatives want more order, less freedom. Communitarians want more equality and order, less freedom. Okay. Whoops, we're going to stop. All right. That's the end of that lecture. I want to just encourage you to make sure you're reading the chapters, studying the vocabulary, etc. I hope you have a good day.